You know the saying, a delayed game is eventually good, but a rushed game is bad forever. What about those games that disappoint no matter the development time and resources allocated? What about those sequels which can't measure up to their predecessors, let alone stand out as noteworthy titles on their own? Such titles are common in the games industry, especially given the sheer number of sequels and blockbusters year in and year out. Check out our top 30 picks for the most disappointing games. Mirror's Edge Catalyst. The fact that the world of Mirror's Edge had such untapped potential to the point that many desired a sequel years after its launch is a testament to its impact. The first-person parkour model would be in other titles, most notably Dying Light, but the focus on platforming and skill-based jumping, not to mention the gorgeous dystopian world, helped it stand out. So when DICE finally announced Mirror's Edge Catalyst, which offered a more open world, the excitement was palpable, even if it was revealed to be a reboot. While it retained the fluid movement and responsive controls, the world felt barren, the story rudimentary, and the ending inane. DICE has no plans to return to the franchise, and for all of its appealing aspects, Mirror's Edge is pretty much dead. Rise of the Ronin. As a fan of Team Ninja's Neo series, and even finding some enjoyment in Wolong Fallen Dynasty, it's sad to see how Rise of the Ronin turned out. On one hand, it's earned some praise for its combat and even the directions you can take the story. On the other hand, critics have expressed disappointment with its open world, English voice acting, story, and visuals. While there were plenty of comparisons to Sucker Punch's Ghost of Tsushima, I feel that they're both distinct enough and trying to do their own thing, so why is Rise of the Ronin so underwhelming? Well, for starters, it's a PS5 exclusive in development for 7 years, with Sony support, which lends certain expectations. This isn't to say that all reviews were equally hard on the game, as indicated by the 76 Metascore, but ranking 5th in physical sales for the UK at launch and dropping to 14th place the next week is nothing short of disappointing. Need for Speed 2015. Years of requests for a new Need for Speed Underground title, and Electronic Arts delivered. Sort of. Employing real-world legends, it was ultimately about a cast of street racers struggling to get noticed. While the customization and visuals received praise, the uninteresting story, AI prone to rubber banding, multiplayer, and lack of certain features, including drag racing, soured fans. There was also the always online requirement with no option to pause. It would have qualified as one of the weaker games in the franchise, but then Payback happened and drastically lowered the bar. Biomutant. When a game like Biomutant promises a massive world with choices and consequences, extensive character customization, vehicles, deep combat, mechanics, and much more, it's hard to not get hyped. The fact that it was 5 years in the making, with Experiment 101 consisting of former Just Cause developers, further contributed to this. However, all of those intriguing bits turned out to be incredibly shallow. From the story and combat to the mission design and annoying narrator, an update helped improve things, and with 1 million units sold in a few months, it was far from a flop. The Order 1886. Ready at Dawn's The Order 1886 received extensive attention for its graphics with gorgeous facial animation and lighting. The presentation also received significant praise, but everything else left much to be desired. The campaign was ephemeral, with the disappointing story despite such an intriguing setting and premise, and over-reliance on quick-time events bogging down the overall gameplay. Ending on a cliffhanger with no prospects for a sequel didn't help either. Exoprimal. Piloting exosuits to battle hordes of dinosaurs sounds like a good idea in theory, but what is live service? The developers' bid to join the trend resulted in Exoprimal, which featured a story focused on time traveling, simulations run by rogue AI called Leviathan, and so much dino slaying. The story felt disjointed, with the characters getting little development, and the lackluster map variety and repetitive objectives brought the experience down. The developer has expanded on the different modes, at least while also adding new alpha variants of exosuits. Beta variants are coming soon, but its launch state was just so underwhelming. Star Fox Zero. Not that Star Fox had the best run since peaking with Star Fox 64, but Zero had Platinum Games involved. Surely the Wii U console would allow for a compelling shoot-'em-up experience. As you probably guessed, that isn't the case, as the controls were criticized for their unwieldiness. It also didn't help that the experience heavily mirrored Star Fox 64. though some critics enjoyed that approach. With less than 500,000 copies sold, it flopped hard, and there hasn't been a follow-up ever since. Thief 2014. One of the most beloved cult classic stealth series of all time, Thief was considered as revolutionary for PC players as Metal Gear Solid for consoles. So when Eidos Montreal announced a reboot, there was excitement and perhaps a little trepidation, especially after Garrett's old voice actor was replaced. A dull performance was the least of the game's problems, with the level design, AI, and story all feeling out of sorts. While opinions settled more on the slightly above side, Thief 2014 couldn't match up to the original games in player freedom and choice. Days Gone. The praise for Days Gone, Bend Studios' open-world zombie survival title, cropped up most when it was free on PlayStation Plus. Full credit to the team for sticking with it and adding sizable new content and features, but that's not the launch version. The latter was roundly criticized for its excessive bugs, performance issues, and loading screens, that too after delays for more polish. To say nothing of the bland story and awful dialogue. The open world, the motorcycle maintenance mechanics, the shooting, nearly everything had its downsides. Make no mistake, there were some positives, from the immense undead hordes to the progression, and it notched up some impressive sales numbers, topping the UK physical charts for 3 weeks in a row and outselling the combined total of Bend's previous games. However, it was nowhere near the high bar set by first-party Sony titles. Perhaps for this reason, the publisher didn't greenlight a sequel, and directors John Garvin and Jeff Ross subsequently left the studio. As beloved as it is now, there's no denying that Days Gone underwhelmed some at launch. Rage 2. For its time, Rage was trying to do something technologically ahead of its time, courtesy of id Tech 5. However, it faced criticism for its overall story and forgettable characters, not to mention the aggravating cliffhanger at the end. The fact that it launched after the more successful Borderlands, which captured the Mad Max feel of a post-apocalyptic wasteland far better, also didn't help. Nevertheless, it did receive some praise for its visuals, combat, side missions, and AI. With Rage 2, Avalanche Studios decided to go for a more traditional open-world first-person shooter with vehicles. You had the usual enemy camps to clear, some points of interest, and enemy convoys to assault, while the story was a paint-by-the-numbers, gather the MacGuffins before a showdown with the big bad. The combat and the visuals were still worthy of praise, but everything else felt further downgraded over the original, and it had microtransactions. Immortals of Aveum. Coming from a new team with a 5-year development cycle and emphasis on a single-player campaign with no microtransactions, Immortals of Aveum was a noble endeavor. Problems arose from the overall story, graphical issues on consoles, iffy dialogue with the cast trying its very best to elevate it, and controls. With the emphasis on fast-paced mage combat, encounters could feel repetitive, ultimately underwhelming despite some impressive set pieces. Again, it received updates and new content while attracting a following, but Immortals of Aveum failed to leave a mark. Shenmue 3. A sequel that fans and creator Yu Suzuki craved since the second game's release in 2001, an announcement years in the making with $6 million in crowdfunding, a launch finally happening 4 years later. Mired in controversy due to Epic Games' store exclusivity and a publishing deal with Deep Silver, Shenmue 3 finally arrived in 2015 and was panned for its outdated mechanics and storyline that ended on yet another cliffhanger. While some found the antiquated mechanics to be the appeal, it ended up feeling inconsequential and just another chapter in the ongoing story which would likely end. The Callisto Protocol. Spiritual successors to classics from the original creators never fail to generate attention, as seen with Striking Distance's The Callisto Protocol. The Dead Space tribute sported gorgeous visuals punctuated by over-the-top and grotesque death sequences. Delays and declarations of crunch didn't help, nor did the performance issues at launch. Of course, despite all of that, the experience was dragged for being overtly linear, with shoddy melee combat, no option to skip the death scenes, a short playtime, heaps of unrealized potential, and ultimately just not measuring up to the legacy of Dead Space. Rainbow Six Extraction. After the success of the limited-time mode Outbreak in Rainbow Six Siege, the developer did what any self-serving publisher would do: spin it off into a new game and monetize it. Extraction would take a while to launch, initially announced as Rainbow Six Quarantine in 2019 and eventually abandoning the name for obvious reasons. It would finally arrive in January of 2022 after multiple delays and revealed itself as a session of interconnected areas with procedurally generated objectives and enemies. The sparse content, terrible objectives, bad AI, laughable story, and repetition sadly made for a dull experience. While the developer would tout 3 million players in the first week, likely in no small part thanks to Game Pass, you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who remembered it past the first month. Crackdown 3. Before Microsoft pushed cloud gaming via Game Pass, it hyped the computational powers of the same and how they would revolutionize gaming. Crackdown 3 was an example, touted as having a fully destructible open world. It eventually relegated into a separate mode, which quickly died out, while the base campaign launched after years of delay and generated ire for its archaic, repetitive design. Could you have some mindless fun? Sure, but it was a far cry from what Microsoft hyped the project to be, and far from the next big leap for the franchise. Resident Evil 3 2020. Resident Evil 3 Nemesis has always had a weird place due to its shorter length and unorthodox features, like the titular villain. Releasing in the shadow of the brilliant Resident Evil 2 didn't help. Unfortunately, that same fate awaited Resident Evil 3 Remake. Despite some fantastic visuals and combat, it was more notable for omitting areas. City Hall, the Clock Tower, and more were nowhere to be seen, or changing some of the original's most iconic moments. Barring the final sequence, none of them felt like an improvement. The fact that Mercenaries wasn't included, but we got Resistance, a terrible asymmetrical multiplayer mode, didn't help. Even with sales at 8.4 million, Resident Evil 3 is considered the weakest of the modern remakes. Wolfenstein Youngblood. Machine Games delivered not one but two excellent Wolfenstein titles, reviving the franchise for a new generation with some incredibly cinematic storytelling that remains impressive to this day. How did it follow these up? Why, with a co-op title focusing on BJ Blazkowicz's daughters, Jessie and Zofia. The initial gameplay showings weren't terrible, and the prospect of venturing to Paris to take out Nazis was appealing. Unfortunately, Wolfenstein Youngblood fundamentally failed to capture what had made the previous games so successful. Enemies were bullet sponges, causing players to constantly run out of ammo, and the missions were forgettable, with bizarre hub-like stages that felt utterly unnecessary to the campaign's flow. Throw in terrible AI when playing solo and microtransactions, and it felt like a poorly conceived side story rather than a proper follow-up to Machine Games' hits. Forspoken. You want to believe that Luminous Productions had good intentions when designing Forspoken, first announced as Project Athia, boasting a premier writing staff and billed as a 2-year PS5 exclusive. It could have been the developer's next big thing. While the combat wasn't terrible, it did little to uplift the barren world and dull activities. The initially awful dialogue and plot also weighed it down, but even as things improved over time, the story was over quickly. It wasn't long before the developer declared that Forspoken sales were lackluster, and by May, Luminous was reorganized and merged into a publisher. Mighty No. 9. Also considered one of the worst games ever made, Mighty No. 9's development history would have suggested otherwise. It was helmed by a new team at Concept, who promised a spiritual successor to the Mega Man franchise when the developer had effectively kept the series on the back burner. Then the delays happened, and the whole second Kickstarter campaign to fund a completely different project. By the time Mighty No. 9 launched, it was beset by performance issues, terrible voice acting, lack of content, and an overall feel that screamed cheap imitation rather than spiritual successor. Skull and Bones. Before its multitude of delays that whittled any faith that anyone had in the developer to deliver a competent pirate game, Skull and Bones had some potential. Of course, then the delays happened, followed by reports of reboots, behind-the-scenes issues, incompetent upper management, leadership departures, etc. When Skull and Bones was close to launching for real this time, the developer made the baffling decision to call it a quadruple A game instead of the tried-and-true AAA. Upon launch, and to no one's surprise, Skull and Bones was a live service grind for loot punctuated by increasingly dull missions and tedious back and forth. Good thing it sold for $70 and included microtransactions. The results were telling. Less than 1/4 of Sea of Thieves' launch sales in the UK and allegedly 850,000 players, including those who played the free trial. Marvel's Avengers. Marvel's Avengers didn't have the best of reveals, competing against the first-player gameplay of Final Fantasy VII Remake on the same E3 showcase. Nevertheless, despite how many felt about the lack of resemblance to the Marvel Cinematic Universe actors, it didn't look terrible either. Live service was seeing a downturn, but with Crystal Dynamics and Eidos Montreal at the helm, how could it go wrong? Cut to the underwhelming beta and full release, and the distinction between Marvel's Avengers and a title like Marvel's Spider-Man became clearer. Despite unique kits for its heroes and some decent visuals, the mission design, objectives, and loot were subpar. Post-launch support added some new heroes and content, which did little to raise the player count, and it was subsequently delisted from storefronts in September of 2023. Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3. While one may claim that Call of Duty is a disappointment year in and year out, and that is certainly a very solid claim, Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 felt especially egregious. The painfully short campaign with its lackluster and ultimately inconsequential story that sets up yet another sequel, we've seen it all at this point. Perhaps even worse is the open combat missions, promising sandbox-style action but coming off as lazy with simplistic objectives. Multiplayer was kneecapped out of the gate, and age-old issues of skill-based matchmaking and connection issues still cropped up. At least the microtransactions continue to roll in. Anthem. After the mess of Mass Effect Andromeda, it was the turn of the main BioWare team to produce something special. It was a live service looter shooter, which emphasized co-op over the developer's tried-and-true single-player story-driven approach. As impressive as the initial gameplay reveal seemed, it was reportedly fake. Anthem's development period was plagued with issues, from crunch to terrible management. The result is a mess, with poor characterization and dialogue, bad mission design and objectives, a baffling lack of quality of life, performance issues, bugs, glitches, unimaginative loot, and a barren endgame. Despite changes and updates, Anthem's attempt at a do-over was ultimately rejected by EA, and support is effectively dead, though servers remain available. Ghost Recon Breakpoint. Speaking of an underwhelming launch, we have the Ghost Recon franchises going from Wildlands, which grew into something great, to Ghost Recon Breakpoint and its removal of AI teammates, looter-shooter elements, bland open world, bullet sponge drones, bugs, glitches, the list goes on. Why did the developer suddenly want to adopt a shared world shooter approach with the franchise, besides live service revenue? No one knows, but it was disastrous. The developer would eventually claw a good game out of it, one that still fell short of Wildlands, but at least offered a more tactical experience without worrying about gear scores. Resident Evil 6. If Resident Evil 6's trailers were full of action, there was still the hype behind seeing so many fan-favorite characters, and Jake tearing it up together. The result offered some pretty good combat, but flopped in multiple ways. The characters felt off, and the overall pacing of walk a few feet, cutscene, rinse, repeat was a killer. While Resident Evil 6 saw decent sales, its critical reception was in the gutter, but thankfully it led to the rebooting in Resident Evil 7 Biohazard. Payday 3. Considering the ups and downs that Payday 2 saw, it was in a pretty good spot by the time Starbreeze stopped producing new content. Payday 3 would have been the perfect opportunity to start over with a fresh new slate, avoiding its predecessor's mistakes, while ushering in a new age of heist-focused co-op gameplay. Of course, it wasn't to be, with the always-online requirement and lack of an offline mode souring fans early. This would come back to bite the development team when server and matchmaking issues ensured fans couldn't play for days. Even after their resolution, the sequel faced heavy criticism for removing features present in Payday 2, whether it was the pre-heist planning map, text chat, or just the option to unready. Sales were below expectations, and given the poor reception, Starbreeze had replaced its CEO to try to turn the ship around. Thus far, it doesn't look like it's happening anytime soon. Redfall. Arcane Austin, which specialized in immersive sims like Dishonored and Prey, didn't inspire too much confidence when it was revealed to be working on a co-op looter shooter. The lack of an offline mode or progress for other players except the host in co-op also didn't help. On the bright side, the state of Redfall made both issues feel like water under the bridge. Horrendous AI, performance issues, bugs galore, including catchy music playing during serious scenes, horrible bosses, a dull story, lackluster characterization, bad mission design, everything went wrong. You may argue that expectations were low, but Redfall sunk lower and still flounders despite some major updates. Battlefield 2042. This one hurt for longtime fans of the genre, especially coming off of a relatively disappointing Battlefield 5. With no campaign, Battlefield 2042 promised a return to everything that made the genre great, wrapped in the veneer of modern combat and massive 128-player battles. Reports emerged of troubled development, and the beta earned some ire, but fans were still hopeful. Cue the disappointment and savage response on Steam, with a sequel becoming one of the lowest-rated games in the genre's history overnight. From the removal of the class system to the visuals, destructibility, map design, and the scoreboard, that damned scoreboard, Battlefield 2042 was a letdown in every way. It improved over the years, but is still a far cry from the genre's peak. Suicide Squad killed the Justice League. Before it was revealed as a live service looter shooter with a boring mission design, Suicide Squad Kill the Justice League had a suitable amount of hype. How could fans not be excited when it was Rocksteady's first new game since 2015's Batman Arkham Knight? After its disastrous showing last year, it was delayed almost a year from its original release. Maybe it would add an offline mode and tone down the live service elements, including but not limited to microtransactions and a battle pass. As it turns out, none of these things happened, and when Suicide Squad launched, it was begrudged for its terrible mission design, repetitive gameplay, and boring endgame. After Warner Bros. Admitted that it fell short of expectations, Rocksteady would focus on fixing the plethora of network issues and bugs while prepping for the first post-launch season. Unsurprisingly, Season of the Joker was another miserable disappointment with its utter lack of story content, boring new missions, annoying grind to unlock the Joker as a playable character, and the audacity to charge for immediate access. Mass Effect Andromeda. Of all the games to disappoint over the years, this one probably hurt the most. It's not like Mass Effect Andromeda was the next mainline title in the franchise, or one that had the budget and resources of Mass Effect 2 and 3. However, as the first new entry in 5 years, fans looked forward to it all the same. The potential for a new story and setting with an open-world twist also sparked interest. When Andromeda launched, it was quickly clowned for its bugs, facial animation, and dialogue. Those who dived deeper discovered barren planets, uninteresting characters who couldn't hold a candle to the original heroes, and a low-stakes plot. The underwhelming critical reception and sales wouldn't outright kill the franchise entirely, as evidenced by the recent Legendary Edition and upcoming sequel, but it was the first time that fans began to question BioWare. Of course, Anthem happened, and the rest is history, but Mass Effect Andromeda hurt more. That's all for now. If you enjoy what you saw, please hit the like button. And if you're new to the channel, now is a great time to subscribe. We upload brand new videos every single day. After subscribing, don't forget to enable all notifications by clicking the bell icon. Thanks for watching this video, and we'll see you next time, right here on Gaming Bolt.